All right.
Hey everyone, I'm so happy that you're listening. Welcome to Kweller Prep's SAT Grammar webinar. I'm really happy that you're here and listening. Douglas, thank you so much for doing this. We are so honored that you are the book author and the presenter for our Kweller webinar. Thank you, Douglas. Without further ado, take it from here and we're looking forward. Okay, I'll be on mute. I'll be in the background.
All right. So hi, everyone. So today's webinar is going to be the Kweller Prep SAT Grammar webinar. So it's going to be focused on the writing and language section of the SAT. And this is often the section I find the most rewarding to tutor because in many cases, this is a section that students come to me scoring weakest in. And the same thing goes for the ACT English as well, which is really similar to the SAT grammar part. But it often ends up being the section that, believe it or not, they actually do best in, or at least the one they improve the most in. And that's often because a lot of times they just haven't studied a lot of this material in their English classes in middle school and high school. But once they actually take the time to learn the material deeply, it often ends up being the one that they end up finding easier sometimes than the other sections. So as far as the plan for today's webinar, so it's going to be similar to what we did in our first two webinars. So I'm going to start out by giving you just an overview of the test format, the scoring, the question types. After that, I'll give you some advice on how to prepare specifically for the grammar section. Then I'll share with you a description of some key features of the grammar book, which I actually just recently updated with another 75 pages. And I made some changes to it based on some principles of learning sciences that I studied in my master's program at Harvard. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the format changes that I made to the book. And then finally, we'll walk through the first passage of the March 2021 SAT grammar. So as far as the format of the test, so it consists of 44 multiple choice questions that you have 35 minutes to do. And one thing to note is that it is a passage-based test, just like the ACT. This wasn't always the case with the SAT. So even though the majority of the questions could be answered just by reading one sentence to figure out how to correct it, all of the sentences that you get are going to be within the context of some larger passage that you're reading. And that's because the goal of the College Board is to have you act as an editor to an unnamed writer. So by editing in the context of a passage, it's more reminiscent of the type of editing work you'd be doing in the real world, rather than just giving you, random isolated sentences. So you're going to have 4 total passages that are 11 questions per passage. And then as far as the genres of the passage, so typically one passage is going to be mainly focused on some sort of humanities theme, so maybe literature or art, for example. One is going to be more of a social studies or history related passage. One will relate to some topic related to careers, like an issue in careers, or a topic about maybe a passage about a specific career. And then there's one that will be a more natural science related topic. And again, you don't need to have any specific background knowledge on these topics, but of course it can potentially be a little bit helpful if you do happen to randomly know about it. But overall, I just wanted to kind of let you guys know that so you just know generally what to expect. What's most important is that you read the passages carefully as you go along and that you're consistent within them for the questions you answer, especially those that are style-based or reading comprehension-based. The last thing I wanted to comment about in terms of the structure of the test has to do with the text complexity. So you might remember back in the SAT reading webinar, I mentioned how the passages go from the 9th grade level all the way up to the college level. So on the writing and language part, they only go up to the 10th grade level. So they're much easier to understand and they're very straightforward. So even if you are somebody who does struggle with those more advanced SAT reading passages, especially when they start using a lot of advanced vocabulary words, or if you just struggle with the more advanced analysis questions on the reading section that really require you to do a very close reading or make really subtle distinctions between sometimes 2 plausible seeming answer choices, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have the same issues on the writing and language section. So they are distinct tests. So it's very possible that you'll do significantly better on one part than the other in either direction. That being said, there is an overlap in terms of some of the literacy skills that are tested on both exams. So if you are an exceptionally strong reader with good vocabulary, that can definitely help you on certain question types. But in general, though, even the questions that are more reading based tend to be more focused on following the general gist of what's going on rather than doing a super close reading. And also the passages are just easier to understand to begin with. And then the last thing for this slide I want to just go over pretty quickly is just scoring. So we've talked a lot about this in the other webinar. So the situation is pretty similar here. So again, you get a raw score, which is a total number of questions you get right out of 44. But again, as we talked about in the other webinars, the raw score is not actually what counts. So it's your scaled score that counts. So the your raw score out of 44 is converted to a scaled score that ranges from 10 to 40. And then that's added to your reading scaled score and multiplied by 10. So you'll get an overall English score of 200 to 800. And as I mentioned with the math and reading sections, there's no specific cutoff that guarantees that a certain number wrong will give you a certain grade. It really depends on the difficulty level of the test. So the harder the test is, the more lenient the conversions will be between raw and scaled scores. So in the past webinars, I've given you some of the more extreme examples of curves on hard and easy months. So I did look up a few, and of the ones I was able to find, there were some past months where the test was particularly hard, where 41 out of 44 questions right actually converted to a 38 out of 40 scaled score, which is a genuinely outstanding grade. So that's a really high score to get. So it probably won't be regarded any differently than a 40 would, honestly, by most schools. But on a few months where the test was unusually easy, 3 questions wrong was only a 34 out of 40, which is still a really good grade, but it's pretty low for only getting 3 questions wrong. And that's because a student who got 3 questions wrong on one of those months where the test was really easy would be expected to get around 7 questions or so wrong on one of those months where the test was really hard. So that's why they do equating to make sure that the scaled scores are comparable regardless of whether or not the test is easy, medium, or hard. All right, so that's it for that slide. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about more in terms of just the overall format of the test has to do with the question types. So one thing that I didn't actually mention directly in the math and reading webinars, but this does apply to those tests as well, is that in addition to your official scores, which range from 200 to 800, and those are the grades that actually matter, you do get these unofficial subscores that range from 1 to 15, with 15 being the highest, and they're for informational purposes only, but they could give you a better idea of which question types are your stronger areas and which question types are maybe the areas of weakness that you most want to improve on. So when it comes to the writing and language section, there are 2 subscores that you should pay special attention to. So that's your convention subscore and then your expression subscore. So for conventions questions, which I think there'll be around 20 questions or so of the few tests I looked at where they did release subscores. This was the number of conventions questions they had. So these will require you to revise text to conform to the structure, usage, and punctuation rules from standard English. So typically only one answer choice is going to be both grammatically and logically correct in these questions, with a few rare exceptions. We're actually going to see one like that today on question 2 of the March 2021 test we do. But for the most part, only one answer will be grammatically correct. So this is where kind of learning all the grammar rules really comes into play. And then the other question types of the remaining questions, so about 24 of them or so, will be what are called expression questions. So these require you more to analyze the strategic choices that writers make and to revise them for effective and accurate development of ideas, organization, and language use. So in these questions, it's possible that all answer choices will be grammatically correct, but the wrong choices are often ineffective, either in terms of their accuracy, coherence, or writing style. So for example, an accuracy error might be if they give you an answer choice that's interpreting data from a graph, they might interpret the data wrong, or they might use an incorrect vocabulary word. In terms of coherence, a possible error might be that they might include a random detail that's true and grammatically correct, but it's just not really relevant to what the author's talking about. So you're better off deleting it or replacing it with a more relevant one. And as far as writing style errors, types of errors you might see involve errors of wordiness, or maybe errors of being too informal or casual in your language when you're supposed to be more formal or proper. So these are kind of the errors that are tested on these questions. And one thing to note is that some students are pretty evenly matched when it comes to the convention and expression questions, but I have noticed just anecdotally in working with students, even among those who ultimately get the same grade or very similar grades, most of them tend to be notably better in one of these categories than the other. So for example, a few years ago, I worked with 2 students who are actually really good friends with one another. They were both pretty evenly matched on the English part. I think when all was said was done, they ended up only being 10 points apart on the English overall. So they were both, very high scoring students. But I noticed on the grammar section in particular, when I was working with them, they tended to get very different questions wrong, even though they were getting about the same number of questions wrong. So one of the students was probably one of the most outstanding readers I've ever worked with. He actually used to get yelled at as a child for reading in class when he wasn't supposed to. So the reading section just came really naturally to him. And he also did really well with the expression questions. I do think I remember him getting like a 14 out of 15 score one of the months he took it. Like he was really good with those questions, but he would struggle on some of the more advanced and even some of the easier, to be honest, but usually the harder conventions questions, because he didn't fully take the time to really study some of those more obscure rules and really internalize them deeply. Where his friend, on the other hand, was someone who admittedly did not like reading. He's more of a math science person. So he often did really well on the conventions questions, sometimes even getting them all right, but he would struggle on some of the hardest expression questions, like those that required either vocabulary knowledge or that required you to really understand what the text was saying deeply. So just be aware that you might end up with the same grade as someone, but for very different reasons. So really focus on which question type is giving you the most difficulty, if there's a pattern in that, and that could kind of guide how you go about doing your studying, depending on whether you're stronger at one of these areas or the other. All right, so I think that's all I wanted to say in terms of the general format. So the next thing I'm going to go over is just advice on how to prepare for the grammar section. Well, the first four are actually more preparation. The fifth is more something to do on the test day itself. So the first thing that I want you to make sure you do, which is why I highlighted it, because I think it's really important, is make sure you take the time to really master the fundamentals of grammar terminology, because doing so will provide you with the tools to make sense of the grammar rules that you ultimately need to apply to correct the sentences on the test. And this is something that some students think they could just kind of gloss over. And I know it's something that's not necessarily emphasized in a lot of English classes anymore, but it is important you take the time to study them, because while the College Board, they're never going to ask you to identify any grammar terminology by name, they do expect you to know what those terms are and what they mean. And if you go on their website and look at the official tests that they have released there and that they have explanations for, you'll see that they just casually throw around some really technical terms like prepositions, appositives, dangling modifiers, relative clauses, subordinating conjunctions. So if you don't know what any of those terms mean, you're going to have a harder time following what those explanations are. And just in working with students, I've noticed that those who do really kind of take the vocabulary stuff seriously and really like take time to really master the words and what they mean, they tend to see better improvement than the students who just kind of try to correct the sentences and don't really spend the time doing all that studying. And this seems to be really in line with a lot of the research and how people learn that I've studied in some of my classes during my master's program. So one concept we learned about had to do with the idea that students are able to usually learn better and remember better when they understand kind of the deep structural knowledge of the discipline that they're learning, rather than just trying to, memorize isolated concepts or procedural rules. So in the case of grammar, a student who could really like dissect a sentence and break it into its component independent clauses and dependent clauses and phrases, they're better able to analyze it systematically so that they could correct errors that might be present in that sentence. Whereas a student who doesn't really have that language with which to understand like how the English language is structured, and they can't do that level of analysis, then they have to rely more on intuition and gut feelings. So they're more likely to make mistakes. And a lot of these rules aren't necessarily the most intuitive. So you could be an excellent reader and read at the college level, like one of the students I mentioned before, and still struggle with when to use a comma and when not to. A lot of these things aren't necessarily things you're just going to pick up by reading a lot. Some people might be able to, but most people need to formally study these grammar rules and terms in order to be able to, do well on the harder questions. And then the other aspect from what I've learned about learning has to do with the difference between experts and novices. So people who are experts could often quickly recognize patterns, and they could apply their memory from old situations to new situations to come up with a solution pretty quickly. So one example that we talked about in two of my classes actually were expert chess masters, how you could just show them a random chessboard and they could just kind of immediately figure out or pretty quickly figure out what the best move is to make based on the thousands of matches that they played or seen before. So grammar obviously is nowhere near as complicated as chess, I'd imagine, but there are certain sentence structure patterns that do repeat a lot from test to test. So for example, one question type that a lot of the higher scoring students get wrong are subject-verb agreement questions when there's a prepositional phrase in between the subject and verb. So a student who's able to quickly recognize those is less likely to make a mistake on those types of questions. And that's where kind of drilling and really learning those rules come in. So when I was in middle school, my teachers, we actually used to have quizzes where we have to like remove the prepositional phrase from a sentence, and then we'd have to like circle the subject and then draw a line from the subject to the verb, and then we'd have the prepositional phrase in between. So all of that stuff we did really helped build the intuition to recognize those patterns. So then when it came time for the SAT, it was really easy to do the subject verb agreement questions like that. So I think that's all I really want to say for the studying the fundamentals, but just make sure you take the time to really learn the basic vocabulary. That will help you on the test when you have to actually correct errors. So the second piece of advice, this is applicable to pretty much all sections of the SAT. I think I talked about this last week in the math part as well, but make sure you do practice tests regularly. And then for each test you do, make an error log or do something similar like that to really analyze your knowledge gaps and reflect on the broader lessons learned. So you're never going to see these exact sentences again, but you might see a sentence that's structured in a very similar way, but with different actual content. So you really want to make sure you're learning from your past mistakes and applying them to future tests so that you're less likely to make them again. All right, so the next thing was for the conventions questions specifically, which are the grammar rule base or the grammar rule questions, as well as certain expression questions that are kind of more rule and principle based. So the concision questions and syntax questions are examples of that. Really study and drill these question types as needed until they become second nature to you. So in addition to the drills in my book, I know Khan Academy actually has topic specific quizzes on pretty much all the convention and some of the expression topics. So I recommend doing those. They're automated quizzes. I think they just give you 5 random questions at a time. And every time you click it, it will be like a different set of questions. So that would be a good place potentially to study for those. But in addition to actually just learning the rules and drilling them, what's probably going to end up being just as important, if not more important on the day of the test, is to also work on becoming sensitive to cues in which to apply the rules. So one concept we talked about in 2 of my classes were thinking dispositions, which are just patterns of behavior that good thinkers have, which are important when you're learning a new skill, and involve kind of 3 overlapping behaviors that are distinct from one another, or non-overlapping behaviors that are distinct from one another, but which each are really important when you're trying to master a new skill. So one of them is inclination, which is actually desire to learn or apply the knowledge. So I think for anyone who's at this webinar, that's not going to be a problem. You're all clearly very motivated, just the fact that you're coming to this. The other is ability, which is your actual knowledge of the rule or skill or whatever it is that you're learning. So that some of you might not know all the grammar rules yet, but I'm very confident that that's something anyone could learn who really takes the time to study. The hardest part, in my opinion, is sensitivity, which is becoming aware of occasions that actually call for you to apply for the knowledge that you already have. So remember last week in the math webinar, I was talking about how you should pay attention to why you get certain questions wrong. And I gave the example of 2 students getting a quadratic equation question wrong. I said one student might get it wrong because they don't know the quadratic formula, so they don't have the knowledge. So that would be a lack of ability. But another student might have the knowledge of the formula, so they have the ability, but they just didn't even realize in the moment that they were supposed to use it because the question didn't actually directly tell them to. So that would be a problem not of ability because they know the formula. It would be one of sensitivity because they didn't realize that they had to actually use that formula. So the same thing does come into play on the grammar section, especially with some of the more obscure rules that aren't necessarily the most intuitive. So one example of a rule where that comes into play, and I'm not going to teach you about that one today, but I am going to kind of mention it to you today. And hopefully if it's something you don't know, you'll go back and study later. But it's called dangling modifier errors. So it's one of the more obscure grammar rules that often isn't taught in schools. I actually did come from a school that taught me grammar pretty well, actually. Like my middle school and high school teachers in English did a really good job teaching grammar. That was one of the few things they did not teach me, and that would have come in handy on my SAT where there was a question that had a dangling modifier. I actually didn't even learn what a dangling modifier was until I taught SAT classes and was part of the curriculum that was given to me. But anyway, so a lot of students, even high scoring students, will not surprisingly get these questions wrong on their practice tests, and almost every test will have one question on this. But what's interesting though, is when I teach them how to correct that error, most of them are able to learn it really quickly. And I know they understand because I could give them a new sentence or a few new sentences that have that type of error and they could correct it for me like right on the spot, within minutes of learning it. So I know it's not an issue of ability. They could learn it really fast. But the problem is when they do a new test, sometimes a few weeks later or a few months later, they'll still sometimes get those questions wrong. And then when I remind them, in many cases, they'll be like, oh yeah, I remember that, but they just never even thought that was being tested. So in addition to actually learning the rules, you really need to be able to get good at recognizing when they're being tested on test day. So ultimately, after more practice, ideally, whenever you're doing a new test, you should be able to look at a question and then really quickly tell what type of question it is or what rule or rules might be involved in it. And then that could affect how you strategically go about approaching them. All right, so that's all I wanted to say about that bullet point. So for the 4th bullet point, so this advice is more specific to expression questions that are less rule oriented. So like those development and organization questions. So, questions maybe where you have to pick the best topic sentence or put sentences in the correct order, questions like that. So for these questions, if these are ones that give you trouble, so there are a few things you can do. So the first thing obviously is study the strategies, because each of these question types has some specific strategies that are unique to them. So making sure that you're up to date on those can definitely help you if you're stuck on a question and maybe you're kind of torn between two choices. You could turn back to the strategy to help you kind of figure out which choice is more likely to be right. Obviously, practice regularly. So my book will give you some opportunities to do that. Khan Academy, I don't think they have too many topic specific quizzes on these, but they do have passage based quizzes, and those quizzes will have some questions like this mixed in. And honestly, a passage based quiz is probably the best for practicing this type of skill anyway. So beyond that stuff, there are two other things you can do. So one is work on building your general reading and vocabulary skills. So everything I talked about back in the reading webinar on ways you could improve your reading and vocabulary, that will also help you with the expression questions on the writing and language. So I won't go into how to do that, but just know any work you're doing to improve your reading section will also doubly help you with the writing and language for that part. But another thing you can do that's more specific to the writing and language section is try to apply the principles that you're learning into writing and editing your own essays for school. So this is partially grounded in learning science research. So learning is often stronger when you're able to move whatever you're learning from the original learning context, which in this case is the SAT, to a new learning context. And you could see how it applies in another context, or when you're able to apply your knowledge to a more authentic context. So in this case, editing your school papers will be a really authentic application of the skills that you're learning on the SAT. And to be honest, I actually would sometimes turn back to these principles last year during my master's program because I had to write a lot of essays. And oftentimes I would be reflecting on a lot of these basic principles when I was doing editing. So for example, if I was writing an argumentative paper, which was often the case, I would be thinking, do I really need to include this detail in this paragraph? Is it really supporting the point I'm trying to make? That would be like an example of what you do on focus questions on the SAT. So if not, maybe I need to delete that, or maybe I need to move it somewhere else. Another thing I often would frequently reflect on would be the order of my ideas. So sometimes I just wouldn't be happy with the way my essay was flowing. So I'm like, I know what I need to move these sentences around, or I might even need to move these paragraphs around in order for the essay to be in a more logical order. In terms of language use, a lot of times my teachers had very strict, word counts and page counts. And if you went above it, you would lose points. And sometimes I found that my original drafts would sometimes be pretty significantly over, the limit. So I'd have to figure out ways to make it more concise without sacrificing too much actual content. And oftentimes I was able to keep pretty much all the content I had originally, but just made the sentences less wordy or combined sentences as appropriate. So applying the skills you're learning for the SAT to your real life work will definitely help you both in your schoolwork, but also on the SAT as well, because you'll internalize those rules more deeply. And you could also probably practice this with your friends. Like if you want to give each other feedback on each other's essays, from like the lens of how you would edit an SAT passage, give each other's feedback in terms of, how you develop your ideas, how you organize your ideas, wordiness. So that's other ways you could get more real world practice. And the last piece of advice is more specific to the test day itself. So even though a lot of the questions you can answer just by reading a sentence and then figuring out how to correct it, I still recommend that you read the entire passage as you go. And also read the title, because that will often kind of clue you into the main idea. So it could help guide your reading. But I've also noticed that on some of the main idea questions, sometimes that I've found a little bit hard and I wasn't sure between two answers, I often found that if I just look at the title, that kind of gives away what the right answer is. So I would recommend do not skip over that part. And then the last thing that we're going to go over before we start really getting into going through the test, we'll do one thing in between that, but I'm just going to go over the format of the book. So overall, the book consists of 29 lessons. So the first two of those lessons cover the fundamental grammar vocabulary. So I already talked about why it's important to review that stuff. And then the remaining 27 or more like SAT-like lessons on the rules you actually need to know. And then every chapter contains drills on the topic covered in that chapter. So most drills are multiple choice to reflect the question types that you'll see on the SAT. But one thing to note is that most of these drills, just for kind of convenience sake, they're not passage based for the most part, because you don't need a whole passage to answer a lot of those questions. So most of the drills are going to be on the sentence level, but depending on the topic, like especially in some of those expression chapters, some of the questions might be more based on a paragraph or based on a few paragraphs. So kind of like mini passages. That being said, I do have 5 SAT-like passages in terms of length at the end of each unit, but they only cover the rules from that unit. So for example, at the end of the punctuation unit, which is about 6 lessons, I believe, There's an SAT-like passage with 11 questions, just like on the SAT, except all 11 questions relate to punctuation. And at the end of the usage unit, there's an SAT-like passage, but all 11 questions relate to usage. So these are things I already had in the book before. So as far as the two new features of the book that I added just recently, one thing I added were some mini constructed response drills to some of the conventions chapters in order to promote more active learning. So these questions might ask you to do things like fill in the blank, explain your reasoning, propose your own suggestions for how to revise certain sentences. So this will allow you to engage with the material in a much deeper way. So hopefully when you do get to the multiple choice questions, you'll be better able to tackle them and you'll have a stronger understanding of the rules. And then the last thing I added were some mixed review drills so 7 of them all together, approximately every 4 lessons or so, to help you review older lessons. And this will also test your memory and as well as help you improve your sensitivity to the rule application. So a few reasons why I added the mixed review drills. One has to do with research shows that you're able to remember material better if you engage in space practice as opposed to just mass practice, which is kind of how the book was structured before, which is how most curriculum is. So before you were just kind of practicing each skill as you learned in that chapter, but now you get to revisit skills later on, sometimes, weeks after you originally learned it. So students are more likely to remember information they learn when they have some kind of gap in between the original time they learn it and when they practice it. So I did that partially to help, with your memory. Also, it will give you a better way to kind of be reflective on your learning because it's possible you might get a lot of questions right when you first learn a topic, but then on a mixed review drill, a few weeks later, you get it wrong. So that's a sign to you that maybe you didn't fully learn the material as deeply as you thought you did, and you might need to revisit certain aspects from that chapter. And it also will help you with sensitivity. So one of the dangers sometimes of doing mass practice, depending on the topic, some of these topics are fairly complex, but if it is one of the simpler topics, one of the dangers of doing that, and this is probably more relevant to certain math topics, is that you could kind of get on autopilot in a way. You could just sort of mindlessly start applying the same rule over and over again. But if you have like mixed questions, then you really have to treat each question. You have to think each time you approach a new question and figure out, okay, what's exactly being tested here? So you can't just kind of get in a mindless rhythm. You have to really pay attention to each question carefully and try to see what the cues are and figure out what's being tested. And it also forces you to kind of reflect back on earlier things you learned since you had more of a break in between the original learning experience and the quiz. So hopefully just adding those 2 changes will help deepen your learning. And then I added some other things in the lessons themselves. So like in the notes, some chapters I now added some tables where I have examples of what are called like contrasting cases. So I'll give you like 2 sentences side by side that are about the same topic, but they're worded slightly differently. So you're forced to pay attention to like the deeper differences in terms of how they're structured grammatically, even though they have similar surface features in terms of what the sentence is actually talking about. And that's also another feature from the cognitive sciences that's supposed to help deepen learning. So hopefully those little changes will be helpful to you as you prepare. All right, so that's all I had for the presentation. So before we go into the SAT, I wanted to show you a very quick excerpt from the book. It's going to take like 2 minutes probably to go through. So I just want to go over 2 basic grammar terms. Actually, oh, here it is. Okay. So there are 2 grammar terms that I want to go over with you today, just to make sure you have a background in, and this will be especially relevant when we get to question 4, which is probably the hardest question we're going to see today in terms of dealing with a lot of technical information. So I just want to quickly talk about the difference between an independent clause and a dependent clause. This is something you're not familiar with. You're probably going to have to spend a little more time reviewing this, but just a quick overview though. So an independent clause or a main clause has all the elements of a complete sentence. So a complete sentence always has a subject and a predicate verb, which tells you what the subject is doing or tells you information about its state of being, and it expresses a complete thought. So if we look at these 2 examples, Dan ran on the boardwalk. So Dan would be the subject because that's the noun performing the action. And then ran on the boardwalk is a predicate. So that's what Dan is doing. So ran would be the verb. And we see that that's a correct and complete sentence. So that's an independent clause. And then I have another independent clause. He was at the concert. So in this case, he is a subject, and then was is the verb, and then was at the concert helps express the complete thought. So that's the predicate. So independent clauses, they could stand alone. They can function as complete sentences. Dependent clauses, on the other hand, while they have subject and verb, they can't stand alone as a full sentence. They need to be connected to an independent clause in order for the sentence to be complete. So to give you one example, I have the independent clause, even though I was tired. So even though is an example of something called the subordinating conjunction, which you'll read about in the chapter after this, and I'll briefly mention them when we go through the test. But basically, these are, you can think of as connecting words or conjunctions that when you add them at the beginning of an independent clause, it makes a sentence incomplete. So even though I was tired, you can't just end the sentence there, or otherwise you have what's called a fragment or an incomplete sentence. So there are two ways that you could correct a dependent clause that's a fragment. So one is just get rid of the subordinating conjunction, so you have an independent clause. So if I get rid of even though, then I'm left with the complete sentence, I was tired. So I is a subject, and then was is the verb. So was tired is a predicate, so that's a complete and correct sentence. Another thing I can do, though, is I could keep the dependent clause, but I just have to add a dependent clause either before or after. So in this case, it would probably make most sense to add one after. So even though I was tired, so that's my dependent clause, I still attended the party. So that's my independent clause. So by connecting them, I have a full sentence. And then I give you some more examples here, which I won't go through all of them. But I mean, if you see like the first one, since it was raining, that can't stand alone. But if I add she wore boots, that's an independent clause. Now it can. If I have this one, wherever there is trouble, that can't stand alone. But if I add this independent clause, Carl's found, now it can. So it's kind of like a very quick overview, but the basic idea is that independent clauses you could think of, they can stand alone, dependent clauses cannot. All right, so with that being said, we'll now get into the first passage of the March 2021 test. So like I said, we'll always start out by just kind of reading the title. So shedding light on the problem. So I know it's probably a passage about light that's contributing to some sort of problem. And they'll tell us what that problem is in the very first paragraph, actually. So plant pollinating insects are essential to the reproductive process of many flowering plants, but the number of these insects are declining around the world. Interestingly, a 2017 ecological study led by Dr. Eva Knopp suggests that artificial lighting, the modern convenience that illuminates many streets, storefronts, and athletic fields, may be contributing to the decline of these organisms. So we know the problem in this case is artificial light that's causing issues in terms of seems to be killing off a lot of these insects. All right, so our first question, just looking at the answer choices, I noticed that they're all different forms of verbs. Remember, I said you want to try to get in the habit of trying to predict what concept is being tested as early as you can. So if I see choices that are all different verbs, the number one candidate for the rule being tested here is going to be subject-verb agreement. So I have some notes that I wrote here, so I'll just slide them up a little bit. So if you see answer choices that are all verbs, the first thing you always want to check for is subject-verb agreement. So the basic idea behind this is that if you have a singular subject, then you need a singular verb to go with it. If you have a plural subject, then you need a plural ones. So for example, you would say they are at the show, but she is at the show. So in this case, we have plural subject, plural verb, singular subject, singular verb. And then if more than one choice is correct in terms of subject-verb agreement, then you might start looking for other errors. So the next biggest candidate would be verb tense, which would be like mixing up past and present and future, for example. And then other things you would look for after that might be potentially fragments, like using an incomplete verb. But in this case, it's actually just going to be a simple subject-verb agreement matter. So what I want to do is I want to figure out, okay, well, what's the subject that's actually doing the illuminating? So illuminating means to light up. So in this case, it's pretty clear that the modern convenience is the thing that's illuminating many streets, and modern convenience refers to artificial lighting. So I want to figure out, okay, so I have my subject is modern convenience. So is that a singular subject or a plural? Well, convenience is a singular term. The plural equivalent of that would have been modern conveniences. So now I need to figure out, okay, so I have a singular subject, so I need a singular verb. So if I look at my first choice, well, that seems to be good because you would say a modern convenience illuminates, whereas modern conveniences illuminate. So B would be wrong because that's plural. If I look at C, are illuminating, that's also plural. If I wanted to do the singular equivalent of this, which is the present progressive tense, I would have needed is illuminating. So C is out. And then D uses the present perfect tense, but I see that's also plural because have is plural. So if I wanted to do the singular version of choice D, I would have needed has illuminated. So B, C, and D are all plural verb forms. So A has to be right by default. So then we don't even need to worry about issues like verb tense. Oh, one thing I wanted to point out is for, oh yeah, here's a tip. So if one choice is singular and the other three are plural, or one is plural and the other three are singular, the different verb is more likely, but not always the correct answer. So that's something to keep in mind. Yeah, so in this case, we said it was A because we needed singular. All right, so now we'll move on to question 2. So looking at question 2, so daytime pollinators such as bees and butterflies have many well-documented threats. So Dr. Knopp's team sought to investigate a potential threat to nocturnal pollinators, artificial light. So I could see that this is going to be a punctuation question. So it's within sentence punctuation. So I need to choose between a semicolon, a colon, no punctuation, or a comma. So before we analyze how to answer this one, I just want to do a quick mini lesson on semicolons and colons, because just from experience, these are punctuation marks that most of my students, or many of them, do not know either one or both of these from before they start test prep. So I'm just going to kind of go over the basics of them. So semicolons, for the most part, function similarly to periods. So we use them when we're separating two independent clauses, which you remember from what I said before, are clauses that can act as full sentences. So to give you kind of 2 examples, first we preheated the oven, then we placed the cookies inside. So you see these are each independent clauses. I could have put a period there instead of a semicolon and started a new sentence with then, and it would make sense. Same thing here. The novel was very long. However, I read it in a day. I read it in a day. So again, I could have made that a new sentence. So a semicolon would be another option. And one general tip, I know it wasn't relevant in this question, but if you ever see an answer choice where you have a semicolon and a period as options, there's a really good choice they're both wrong because they generally mean the same thing. So then you go from already a 25% chance to a 50% chance of getting it right, even if you're not sure between the other 2 choices. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then colons, which are a period on top of itself. So semicolon was a period on top of a comma. So these are a little similar to semicolons in that they do follow independent clauses. So everything before the colon is going to be an independent clause. However, what comes after the colon could either be a word, a list, a phrase, or even another complete sentence that elaborates on what came before the colon. So I often tell my students they could kind of think of it as ending a complete sentence that leaves you hanging, in the sense that it is a complete sentence, but it's missing some information that's kind of leaving the reader wondering. So the information after the colon kind of helps like resolve the mystery for the reader. So another way you could think of it is if the information after the colon can logically follow specifically, a colon would be appropriate. So I just gave you kind of 2 examples here. So Diana has one thing left to do, plot her data. So you see, I could have just ended the sentence that she has one thing left to do. That's not grammatically wrong, but then the reader's left wondering, what is that thing that she has left to do? So Diana has one thing left to do, specifically plot her data, or colon, plot her data. And the same issue with the next sentence. The sisters are very different. One is talkative while the other is shy. So again, I could have just ended the sentence at different and been done with it, but then the reader is left kind of wondering, well, how are they different or why are they different? So I'm telling you, one is talkative while the other is shy. So I'm being more specific. One thing I do want to note, and the SAT usually doesn't get this mean, although they did get this mean in this particular question, but I rarely see them do it, so it kind of threw me for a loop. But there are sometimes cases where grammatically a semicolon or a colon can be, or sorry, yeah, semicolon or a comma can be used in place of a colon. But in those cases, if a colon is appropriate, then that's generally the superior choice. So if we go to this question, I'm just looking at the end part because that's all that's really going to be relevant. All right, so we know that daytime pollinators have many well-documented threats. So Dr. Knopp's team sought to investigate a potential threat to nocturnal pollinators, artificial light. So you might notice that this seems, I could probably put the word specifically there and have it make sense. Her team sought to investigate a potential threat to nocturnal pollinators, specifically artificial light. So I'm clarifying what that threat is. So a colon would be the superior choice there. So A is definitely wrong because remember, a semicolon separates 2 independent clauses. And while we do have an independent clause from the very beginning of that sentence all the way up to pollinators, artificial light is not a full sentence. So it's just like 2 words. So that's not right. C is clearly wrong because we need some kind of a pause there. And if we don't have one, it makes it sound like nocturnal pollinators, artificial light is all like one big term. D, you can make an argument is possibly grammatically correct, but because I could use the word specifically there and I'm signaling an elaboration, B would be the stronger choice. So B would be correct. But again, normally they don't get that tricky, but this was one of the few cases where they did kind of give you two right potential options, but one of them was better. All right, so we'll read the next sentence. To do so, the team located samples of the thistle plant Cirsium oleraceum, which is pollinated by insects in mountain meadows that are ordinarily dark at night. So now we actually have two questions in this one. So before the plant's flowering began, some of the plants were covered with mesh bags to outlaw visits from pollinators. However, others were left unbagged. All right, so we're going to take each part of these like one question at a time. So first, let's deal with question 3. So question 3 is an example of what's called a precision question. So there are two types of precision questions that you'll see on the SAT. So one of them involves using vague language versus specific language, and then the other involves picking the right vocabulary word in context. So one thing you might notice just kind of looking at these choices is that all of these words are not particularly difficult words. So they're usually going to pick pretty common words. What makes them hard, though, is that they're all very similar to each other in meaning. And sometimes they'll give you words that sometimes can literally have the same definition in some contexts, but in other contexts, they're not. So they're words that look similar, but they're not actually interchangeable. So it really requires you to kind of understand how these words are used in context and not just their literal meaning. So you want to make sure you reflect on that stuff. So this question wasn't particularly hard, but some of these are more tricky. And I've often noticed that among my higher scoring students, like those who get, between, 3 and 6 wrong or whatever, the precision questions are often among those few that they do get wrong. One possible trend I've been noticing, I can't make any promises, when I was compiling my book, when I was doing updates, I was going through old tests, and I noticed that on most tests, including up to this one, so March 2021 and earlier, tended to have around 3 or so questions like this out of the 44 on average. But for the later months, I've noticed that if I counted right, it only went down to about 1 out of 44. So it's possible these questions are being de-emphasized, which is good news for you if you have not the best vocabulary, but you're otherwise strong in grammar and a good editor. So in this case, I want to just try to figure out in my own words what they're trying to say is actually happening here. So I know that before the flowering began, plants were covered with mesh bags to do something to visits from pollinators. So I think the idea they're trying to say is they're trying to either stop visits from pollinators or block visits from pollinators. So the only word that would really make sense there is prevent. So they're literally preventing pollinators from visiting. The other choices don't really make sense. You can't really say that the mesh bags oppose visits, that placing the bags opposes visits, because it's not like the bags are actually against the visitors. Maybe you could say like the scientists oppose having the pollinators visit, but otherwise that sounds really wrong. And then A and D have more of like a legal or policy connotation, like we're not making it illegal for the pollinators to visit, and we're not revoking like a privilege they have, like you might revoke someone's computer privileges if they break a rule, for example. So C is the only choice that really makes sense there. All right, so now we'll do number 4. This is probably the most complicated question we're going to be going over today. So after we get through 4, the other ones should be much quicker to go through. So we'll probably go to a little over 8 because I know we got a little bit of a late start, but we should definitely be done by 8:05. But 4 is probably going to be the longest one to go through. So before we go over how to do that, I'm just going to give you kind of a mini lesson on some of the topics to go into it. So I had to oversimplify a little bit just for the sake of this test, but this question will make it really clear to you why I think it's important that you review that fundamental grammar vocabulary. So I tried to make it as accessible as possible, but obviously if you already know what these terms mean, it's going to be probably easier to follow along. So one type of error that shows up a lot on the SAT, and which is what the error that's actually occurring in this question, is something that's called a comma splice. So comma splices are types of run-on sentences that occur when independent clauses or full sentences are incorrectly separated by just a comma. So to give you an example, Lily went to the beach, she had fun. So you see how I could have put a period there and I could have had the full sentence, Lily went to the beach, and then another full sentence, she had fun. So because those can stand alone as full sentences, they're independent clauses, I'm not allowed to just put a comma between them. So one way I could correct that if I wanted to still keep it one sentence is I could put a semicolon, because remember I said semicolons could act as periods. So that's kind of the basics of comma splices. And one context in which comma splices are tested involves parts of speech known as conjunctive adverbs, which the chapter in my book that's right after the one that I showed you a preview of does go over. So conjunctive adverbs you could think of are conjunctions that can start a sentence by themselves when they're followed by a comma. So the most common ones, some of the most common ones are however, for example, therefore, meanwhile, and these are often involved in comma splices. But I just wanted to show you kind of how conjunctive adverbs function. So you notice here, like, for example, you can learn a new sport. Therefore, you should study harder. So these are conjunctive adverbs because I could just put them in the beginning of a sentence, put a comma after them, and then have a full sentence. So that's why these function as conjunctive adverbs. So again, this is something if you're not familiar with, you definitely want to study up on these. But however, I would say by far is the most important one to know because that's usually the one that's involved in errors that they test. And it actually is the case in this question. So anytime you see a conjunctive adverb following a comma in the middle of a sentence, you want to look out for a potential comma splice. So I'm just giving you one example here. So this would be an example of a comma splice. Lily went to the beach, however, she didn't have fun. So you notice Lily went to the beach, that could be an independent clause. But then, however, she didn't have fun, that could be a new sentence, similar to, remember I said conjunctive adverbs could start a new sentence. So if I want to correct that, I would have to change this comma to a semicolon. So now I have Lily went to the beach, that's an independent clause. However, she didn't have fun, that's a full sentence. So I'm all good. However, you're not always given the option to correct with a semicolon because in the real world, there are multiple ways that you could correct a run-on sentence. So changing a comma to a semicolon is just one of them, but the SAT is only going to give you one of many possible ways to correct it. So if you do have a run-on or a comma splice specifically, and you must keep the comma, which you're going to notice you're going to have to do in that particular sentence, which we will go back and analyze afterwards, or possibly have to keep the comma. There are two things that you can do. So one thing is you could add what's technically called a coordinating conjunction, but fanboys conjunctions are kind of the shorthand that we use to remember that. So these are 7 conjunctions, which are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So that's where you get the fanboys from. So you could put that between the independent clauses after the comma. So I gave you one potential correction there. So she went to the beach, and then I changed however to the fanboys conjunction, but she didn't have fun. So by changing however from a conjunctive adverb to a fanboys conjunction, I was able to keep the comma and not have an error. The second option you can do is you can make the second clause a dependent clause. So remember back when we looked at the excerpt from my book, I showed you independent versus dependent clauses. So to make a clause dependent, you would have to change it to what's called a subordinating conjunction. So those are conjunctions like while, even though, when, since. So in this case, I changed the conjunctive adverb, however, to the subordinating conjunction though. And if I just read this last part of the sentence, though she didn't have fun, that's a dependent clause. That can't stand by itself. But when it's connected to the independent clause before it, then the comma is okay. So again, I apologize that there's a lot of technical terminology there. So that's why I really stressed in that one slide that we did the importance of learning a lot of that fundamental vocabulary, because that would obviously make this question a lot easier to tackle. So that being said, though, we'll try to go back and approach this question now. So if we look at number 4, so we see we have the conjunctive adverb, however, in the middle of a sentence, followed by a comma. So we want to check to see for a possible run-on. So if we read everything right before the comma, we have, before the plant's flowering began, some of the plants were covered with mesh bags to prevent visits from pollinators. So that is a full sentence. I could put a period there, and that would make sense. However, others were left unbagged. You see, that could also be a full sentence. So if I did want to keep, however, I would either need to put a period after pollinators and then capitalize however and make a new sentence, or I would need to change this comma after pollinators to a semicolon. Unfortunately, though, I see that is not an option. So I'm going to have to do a different kind of conjunction. That being said, though, the one thing that our original choice did do correctly was that it did use a contrast transition logically, because you see I'm doing the contrast between plants that were covered and those that were left unbagged. So my right answer is also going to have to be some sort of contrast conjunction. So for that reason, I could get rid of D. So that shows cause and effect. So it just doesn't make any sense logically. While does show a contrast, so that could work. And meanwhile also shows a contrast, so that might work. So A, B, and C all are logical, but only one of them is grammatically correct in terms of punctuation. So if I look at meanwhile, this has the exact same problem, however does. It's one of our conjunctive adverbs. Meanwhile, others were left unbagged. That would be an independent clause. So I can't separate that from my first independent clause by a comma. But if I use a subordinating conjunction while, then I'm left with the dependent clause while others were left unbagged. So because that's dependent, then I am allowed to use that comma to connect it to the full sentence before. So B would be correct. So again, this is probably the hardest question on this passage, just in the sense that it really requires the most sophisticated grammar knowledge to have. All right, so the other question shouldn't be as bad to get through. So number 5 is a sequence question. So the writer wants to add the following sentence to the paragraph. Half of the plants in each category were then illuminated during the nighttime hours. So a general tip for these questions is if you're given a new sentence, look out for keywords that indicate what information the new sentence is building on. The new sentence should be a logical bridge between the sentence it follows and the one it leads into. So this is often some place where people could get thrown off. It wasn't so relevant on this question, but sometimes the sentence you have to add actually will logically go after more than one sentence, but if you look at the sentence right after it, it doesn't logically lead into the next one. So you really want to make sure that it not only logically follows a sentence you think it should, but that it logically comes before whatever sentence is after that. So in this case, first thing I want to do is look out for clues about what the sentence might be building on. So I noticed 2 clues in it. So it says half of the plants in each category were then illuminated during the nighttime hours. So the first clue I see is half the plants in each category. So I know the sentence before needs to tell me, at least tell me what, I need to learn what those 2 categories are before I have the sentence. And it also says then illuminated. So illuminating happened later on. So it's probably the second step in a process. So just for time's sake, I'll try to breeze through a little bit reading through this. So the first 2 sentences, so the first sentence basically just talked about the problem that Dr. Knopp's team wanted to investigate. So that's a solid introductory sentence. My second sentence, to do so, it tells you how she located samples of this plant. So you see that logically builds off of sentence 1 because to do so refers to how she investigated the threat. So far it seems to be flowing very nicely. And we know that we were introduced to the plant she collected. We still haven't really learned about the 2 categories though. But in sentence 3, the sentence we just read to do questions 3 and 4, we learned how plants were divided into 2 categories, right? The bagged ones and the unbagged ones. So I'm thinking after sentence 3 seems like a possible option, but I still want to read sentence 4 just to make sense that it logically would lead into 4. And then 4, it says a scientist measured how much fruit each plant produced over the course of its life cycle. So that would be a good concluding sentence. So sentence 3 tells me the 2 categories the plants were divided in. 5 tells me what happened to the plants in each category, or the new sentence, sorry, tells me what happened to the plant in each category. And then my last sentence tells me about the measurements that were done at the end. So C would be correct, but it was still important that we checked 4 just to make sure that 4 would make sense after that. 6 is a much easier question to do. So effectively combined questions, these are called syntax questions. This is actually the very last chapter in the book. So these generally test for wordiness. So basically the wrong choices are generally too wordy. However, if you do have multiple answer choices that are pretty concise and grammatically correct, then the other things you might want to look out for in wrong choices are either a confusing word order or illogical transitions. So for example, maybe using a contrast transition when you're supposed to use a cause and effect, or a cause and effect when you're supposed to use a contrast. So that was kind of the problem with choice D. Back in question 4, the so that wasn't logical when we needed to have a contrast. So we'll go to here. So whereas unbagged plants fruit production changed significantly with light exposure, the bagged plants saw no such effect. The bagged plants couldn't be visited by pollinators. Because of that fact, the bagged plants self-fertilize and thus average only about 15 fruits per plant in dark sites, but 85 fruits per plant in illuminated sites. So again, I see this is kind of choppy and wordy, but I know it's a cause and effect relationship because they have the because of that fact. So I just want to see if there's a choice that kind of keeps that cause and effect relationship in a much more concise way. So A does have a cause and effect, but you see it's very wordy. It has the repetition of pollinators. So that's wrong. B has being that, which is often a red flag that a choice is too wordy if you ever see that. And it's just wordy in general. C, also a little bit wordy. You see the repetition of plants and it uses end rather than because. D, on the other hand, keeps my because. So I have my cause and effect relationship and it's not wordy. So D is right. All right, so 7 and 8 are graph questions. These are pretty straightforward ones. The biggest tip for these, though, is for graph accuracy questions, really make sure you read the questions carefully, closely. Read the questions carefully, and you want to make sure you also pay attention to the axes, labels, and the legends that you're given. So in a question like this, they're going to give you 4 different bars on a bar graph, and a lot of students will sometimes read the wrong bars. So let's make sure we read the question carefully. So we know we're talking about bagged plants. So they're saying here that bagged plants average 15 fruits per plant in dark sites and 85 in illuminated sites. So if I look at my graph, they're talking about bagged plants. So I know I'm looking at this section of the graph, the left side. So I look at the dark and illuminated sites. I see that they're both under 20, but above 10. So maybe like between 15 and 18, for example. So the only choice that would go with that would be choice B. You see the other choices use numbers that are way too big. Those would be people who are looking at the wrong bars. On the other hand, unbagged plants from the dark sites produce an average of 90 fruits per plant, whereas something produce an average of 78 fruits per plant, a 30% decline in fruit production for plants that were illuminated at night. Okay, so which had 78 fruits per plant? So I see that that's going to be this bar over here, which is illuminated and unbagged. So illuminated and unbagged would be choice C. Right, so that was a pretty easy graph one. From these results, the researchers concluded that the nocturnal pollinators are avoiding the unbagged plants and illuminated sites, which blank. So they want to know which choice provides the best transition to the paragraph that follows. So to answer this question, you actually need to read the next paragraph first and then try to predict in your own words, the main idea of it. And then the sentence that's ending the concluding one should be a logical lead into that. So I just kind of had some notes. Make sure you reread the information right before to get a general gist, and then read the next paragraph to find the main idea and make your prediction. So the main idea from the last paragraph, we pretty much just got from what we just read, how the researchers concluded that nocturnal pollinators were avoiding the unbagged plants in illuminated sites. So now if we read the next paragraph, we'll just skim through this. So the scientists also found that the decline in nighttime pollination visits coincided with a decline in visits from daytime pollinators. The precise cause for this dual decline was unclear. One possibility is that the plants were less nourishing to daytime pollinators when no longer visited by nighttime pollinators. So we see that the problem that they found for the nighttime pollinators also applied to the daytime ones. And whatever the reason, artificial illumination clearly has adverse effects on plant pollination, and increasing presence of artificial light and may pose a major problem for biodiversity. Urgent measures must be taken to reduce the negative consequences of the annually increasing light emissions on the environment, says Dr. Knott. She's hopeful that further research will focus on ways to reduce excessive light and revive populations of nighttime pollinators. So we see they talked a lot about the daytime pollinators being affected. They don't know the reason why and how this causes a serious problem. So the only choice that really seems to lead into the next paragraph well is D, because you see they talk about the daytime pollinators. If I look at A, which affected yield of plants, I think we already learned that in this paragraph, so it doesn't really lead into the next paragraph. B, again, it gives you something we already kind of talked about, so it's not really related to the next paragraph. And then C, it's not really related directly to the next paragraph, and it's kind of vague. So D is the only one that mentions something very specific from the next paragraph. And then 10 and 11 are two really quick ones. They actually both these actually test two topics in one. So 10 is a precision question as well as an idiom question. And then 11 is a frequently confused word question along with an idiom question. So I'm just going to talk very quickly about idioms. So idioms you could think of are just common expressions, and they often require you to differentiate between prepositions. So these are words that give more detail about a noun. So some common examples of prepositions would be like of, in, to, with, from. And the thing to remember about idiom questions is that the right answer is right just because it's right, not for any grammatical reason. It's just because that's the way the word has kind of evolved to mean standard English. So for example, they are regarded as experts would be idiomatic, but they are regarded for experts would not be. But you would say they are regarded for their expertise, but not they are regarded as their expertise. So there's no like grammatical reason why the right answer is right and the other answers aren't. It's just kind of the way that we talk. So for idiom questions, the best approach for these is really just to use your ear and see what sounds right. They're not worth studying because there are literally thousands of idioms that you can memorize. Yeah, but I should have said idiom questions, not idioms. Sorry about that. All right, so if we look at this question, so scientists found that the decline in nighttime pollination visits coincided with the decline in visits from daytime pollinators. So coincided with means happened at the same time. So precision-wise, that seems like the right word. And then coincided with, that sounds right to my ear. So that's idiomatically correct. So it's actually right the way it is. So I would argue that actually all of these words, with the possible exception of coexisted, would be good fits for this sentence. Like you could say the decline in nighttime corresponded with the decline in daytime or correlated with, but the key is you would have needed the word with, not for in those. And even coexisted, even if you argue that that would be okay, you would still need to say that they coexisted with, not coexisted to. But A is the only one that's both precise and idiomatic. So now we'll just end on question 11, and then we'll be done for today. So this involves two things: frequently confused words as well as idiom. So they say here, increasing the presence of artificial lighting may pose a major problem for biodiversity. So we need to figure out which presents they're talking about. So when presents is spelled TS, that would be gifts like Christmas presents. So that doesn't make sense. So they're talking about presents as in the availability of. So it would be the presents ending in CE. And then idiomatically, I just have to see which sounds better to my ear, presence of or presence in. So increasing presence of artificial lighting may pose a major problem for biodiversity, or increasing presence in, or the increasing presence in artificial lighting may pose a major problem for biodiversity. So presence of would be the choice that should sound better to you when you say that out loud. So C would be idiomatically correct. Great, and that's it for passage one. So we're done for today. Not sure if Francis is still here. All right. Well, okay. Oh, Francis, are you coming back on? I guess you might have left. Well, thank you all for coming today, and I'll see some of you next week at the hard math webinar, which will be our last webinar. Bye, everyone.